We don't hire people with your kind of problems here, the manager says loudly across the crowded diner as 82-year-old Frank Morrison stands holding his job application. Other customers turn to stare while Frank's weathered hands shake slightly. The same hands that once guided fighter jets through enemy territory over Korea. He quietly folds the paper and heads toward the door, unaware that a young waitress behind the counter just noticed the faded call sign tattoo on his wrist. What happens next will leave you speechless. If you believe our veterans deserve better than this, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what you would have done in this situation. This story needs to be heard. The story. Frank Morrison had been looking for work for 3 months. At 82, most places turned him away before he even sat down. But Frank needed the money. His wife Martha had passed 2 years ago, and the medical bills had eaten through most of their savings. Social Security barely covered rent on his small apartment. The Morning Star Diner seemed different though. They had a help wanted sign in the window for weeks. Frank thought maybe, just maybe, they were desperate enough to give an old man a chance. He had experience too. 40 years working in a machine shop after his military service. His hands were still steady, his mind still sharp. But now, standing in the middle of the busy breakfast crowd, Frank felt the familiar tightness in his chest. The manager, a heavy-set man named Rick, had looked at his application for maybe 10 seconds before making his announcement. We don't hire people with your kind of problems here. The words hung in the air like smoke. Frank had checked the box about his PTSD on the application. He always did. Figured honesty was better than lies. But hearing it said out loud in front of all these people made his face burn with shame. A woman at table 3 whispered something to her husband. 2 construction workers at the counter turned to stare. The morning regulars all seemed to lean forward, waiting to see what would happen next. Rick wasn't done though. He stood up from behind the register, his voice getting louder. Look, old man, I run a business here. I can't have someone freaking out every time a pot drops in the kitchen. What if you have one of your episodes during the breakfast rush? What if you scare off my customers? Frank's jaw tightened. He had worked every day for 40 years without incident. His PTSD was managed. He saw a counselor, took his medication, did everything right. But explaining that now felt impossible. With everyone watching, a teenage girl at the corner booth pulled out her phone, probably recording. Frank noticed her out of the corner of his eye and felt his stomach drop. This was going to end up online. Another viral video of an old veteran being humiliated. Rick kept going, apparently enjoying the attention. You people think just because you served, the world owes you something. Well, newsflash. This is the real world. I need reliable employees, not charity cases with mental problems. The diner fell completely silent. Even the kitchen sounds stopped. Frank felt every eye in the place on him. His hands started to shake, not from fear, but from anger. Pure, controlled anger that he hadn't felt in years. A middle-aged woman near the window shook her head and looked away. An elderly couple at table 5 seemed uncomfortable, but didn't say anything. The construction workers just stared, waiting for drama. Frank took a slow breath. He had faced enemy fire over the skies of Korea. He had brought his damaged plane home with 2 engines shot out. He had buried most of his squadron and somehow kept flying. He wasn't going to let some small-town bully break him now. But before Frank could respond, Rick pulled out his phone too. Maybe I should call the VA, he said with a nasty grin. Let them know they got a loose cannon walking around town looking for work. Probably shouldn't have a driver's license either, right? Can't trust someone with combat trauma behind the wheel. That did it. Frank's vision went red for just a moment. His hand moved instinctively toward his pocket, where he kept his military ID. 60 years of discipline stopped him from saying what he really wanted to say. Instead, he just stood there, letting Rick dig his own grave. The manager was really warming up now. I bet you got discharged for being crazy, didn't you? Probably never even saw real combat. Just another wannabe hero with a sob story. Frank's voice, when it finally came, was quiet but steady. I flew 127 combat missions over Korea. Lost more friends than you've probably ever had. But you're right about one thing. I don't belong here. He turned toward the door, his weathered work boots making soft sounds on the checkered floor. The other customers watched him go, most looking ashamed but none willing to speak up. Frank had almost reached the exit when he heard Rick's final insult. Yeah, run away. Just like you probably did in the war. Frank stopped. His whole body went rigid. In all his years since coming home, no one had ever questioned his service record. No one had ever called him a coward. The words hit him harder than enemy flak ever had. But instead of turning around, Frank just pushed open the glass door and stepped outside. The morning air was crisp, and he could hear traffic starting to pick up on Main Street. He stood there for a moment, trying to collect himself. Inside the diner, most people had gone back to their food, though a few were still stealing glances toward the door. Rick was basking in what he thought was victory, telling one of the waitresses how he had handled that situation perfectly. But Sarah Martinez, the young waitress behind the counter, hadn't moved. She was staring at the door where Frank had disappeared, her face pale. She had seen something that Rick and the others had missed. When Frank had reached into his pocket, his jacket sleeve had pulled up slightly. Sarah had gotten a clear look. At his forearm, where a faded tattoo read Ghost Rider 6 in military-style letters. Her grandfather had been in Korea too, and she knew enough about aviation call signs to understand what she was looking at. Ghost Rider 6 wasn't just any pilot. Sarah's grandfather had told her stories about the Ghost Rider Squadron, one of the most decorated fighter units in the Korean War. They were legends, the guys who flew the most dangerous missions behind enemy lines. And their squadron leader, the man they called Ghost Rider 6, had been famous throughout the Air Force. Sarah's hands were shaking as she untied her apron. She had heard the stories 100 times growing up. Ghost Rider 6 had been shot down twice and walked out of enemy territory both times. He had saved dozens of pilots, bringing home damaged planes that shouldn't have been able to fly. He was a living legend, and he had just been humiliated in front of a room full of strangers. Without saying a word to Rick, Sarah headed for the door. She had to find Frank Morrison before he disappeared. She had to make this right. Outside, Frank was walking slowly down the sidewalk, his shoulders slumped in defeat. For the first time in years, he felt truly old. Maybe Rick was right. Maybe it was time to give up, to accept that the world had moved on without him. Sarah caught up to him at the corner. "Sir," she called out, slightly out of breath. "Sir, please wait." Frank turned around, surprised. The young waitress was standing there, her face flushed from running. "Are you really Ghost Rider 6? She asked quietly. Frank's eyes widened. No one had called him by that name in decades. He studied her face, wondering how she could possibly know. "My grandfather was Airman Rodriguez, 18th Fighter Squadron," Sarah said. "He told me stories about you my whole life. How you brought him home when his plane got shot up over Pyongyang. How you went back for 3 other pilots that same day." Frank's throat tightened. He remembered Rodriguez, a kid from Texas who could barely reach the rudder pedals. Frank had nursed his damaged F-86 home through a thunderstorm, talking him through every maneuver. "Rodriguez made it home because of you," Sarah continued. "He got married, had kids, became a teacher. My whole family exists because of what you did." She snapped to attention right there on the sidewalk and gave Frank a crisp military salute. The same salute her grandfather had taught her when she was little. The same one Rodriguez had wanted to give Frank Morrison 60 years ago, but never got the chance. Frank stood frozen for a moment, then slowly returned the salute. His eyes filled with tears he hadn't shed in years. "Thank you for your service." Ghost Rider 6, Sarah said softly. The next thing Frank knew, Sarah was leading him back toward the diner, her arm linked through his. She pushed open the door and walked him right back to where Rick was still holding court behind the register. The manager looked up, annoyed. "Sarah, what are you doing? I told you to get rid of that old." "This is Colonel Frank Morrison," Sarah announced loud enough for the whole diner to hear. Call sign Ghost Rider 6. He flew 127 combat missions in Korea and brought home more damaged planes than any pilot in his squadron. He saved my grandfather's life and dozens of others. The diner went completely quiet again, but this time it was different. This time, people were leaning forward with respect instead of curiosity. Rick's face had gone white. He was staring at Frank like he was seeing a ghost. Sarah wasn't finished. "He came in here looking for honest work because he needs the money to pay for his late wife's medical bills. And you humiliated a war hero in front of everyone because he was honest about his PTSD." One by one, the other customers started to stand up. The construction workers were first, followed by the elderly couple, then the woman who had been whispering earlier. Even the teenager with the phone put it away and got to her feet. They weren't clapping or cheering. It was more solemn than that. They were showing respect the way you do at a funeral or a memorial service. Frank Morrison, Ghost Rider 6, was finally getting the recognition he had never asked for but had always deserved. Rick tried to stammer an apology, but Frank held up his hand. "Keep your job," Frank said quietly. "But next time you meet a veteran, remember that you're talking to someone who gave up part of their life so you could have yours." Frank turned to Sarah. "Thank you," he said simply. "Your grandfather would be proud." As Frank walked out of the morning Star Diner for the second time that day, he carried himself differently. His shoulders were straight. His step was firm. He was 82 years old. He still needed work, and he still carried the weight of too many lost friends. But for the first time in years, Colonel Frank Morrison remembered exactly who he was.